May 17th, 1944. The ruins of Monte Cassino, Italy. Through the smoke and chaos of artillery fire, a German paratrooper peered down from his defensive position at the Allied supply lines snaking up the mountain. What he saw made him question his sanity. A bear. A massive Syrian brown bear, standing upright on its hind legs, was carrying a wooden crate of artillery shells. Not dragging it, not struggling with it, carrying it, with the casual efficiency of a trained soldier, passing it to a Polish gunner who didn't even flinch at the sight. The German rubbed his eyes. Days without sleep, constant bombardment, the stress of defending an impossible position against wave after wave of Allied assaults. He must be hallucinating. Bears don't carry ammunition. Bears don't wear uniforms. Bears certainly don't march in formation with human soldiers. But when he looked again, the bear was still there, moving methodically through the supply chain, lifting crates that normally required 4 men to handle, never dropping a single shell, despite the thunder of incoming mortars and the scream of artillery overhead. The bear worked with purpose, with understanding, with something that looked disturbingly like military discipline. This wasn't shell shock. This wasn't a fever dream. This was Wojtek, a Syrian brown bear who held the rank of corporal in the Polish 22nd Artillery Supply Company. And his presence on that blood-soaked Italian mountainside represented one of the most extraordinary stories of the Second World War, a tale that blurred the boundaries between mascot and soldier, between military necessity and genuine companionship, between the absurdity of war and its occasional moments of unexpected humanity. The story of how a bear became a soldier begins not in the mountains of Italy, but in the ancient landscapes of Persia, where desperation and hope collided in the spring of 1942. In April 1942, the mountains near Hamadan in western Iran witnessed an exodus unlike any in modern history. Thousands of Polish citizens, recently freed from Soviet Gulags and labor camps, were making their way south through Iran toward British-controlled territory. These were the survivors of Stalin's mass deportations, men, women, and children who had endured the frozen camps of Siberia, the disease-ridden work details of Kazakhstan, the starvation rations that killed tens of thousands. Among them were the soldiers who would form Anders' army, named after their commander, General Władysław Anders. These men had been Polish officers and enlisted personnel taken prisoner when the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland on September 17, 1939. They had spent nearly 2 years in Soviet captivity, witnessing the disappearance of thousands of their fellow officers, murders that would later be revealed as the Katyn massacre. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, had changed everything. Suddenly, Stalin needed allies. Under British pressure, the Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement of July 1941 resulted in an amnesty for Polish prisoners, allowing the formation of a Polish army on Soviet soil. General Anders, himself just released from Moscow's Lubyanka prison, was appointed commander. By the end of 1941, 25,000 soldiers had been recruited from the camps, forming 3 infantry divisions. But the Soviet authorities, facing catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, couldn't or wouldn't provide adequate supplies for the growing Polish force. By early 1942, with his men starving and Soviet cooperation deteriorating, Anders made a fateful decision. He would evacuate his entire force from the Soviet Union, taking not just soldiers, but civilian refugees, families, and orphaned children. Between March and August 1942, approximately 115,000 people crossed the Caspian Sea from Krasnovodsk to the Iranian port of Pahlavi. It was a mass exodus from communist captivity to British protection. It was during this chaotic migration through Iran that a group of Polish soldiers encountered a young Iranian boy at a train station. The boy carried a jute sack, and inside that sack was something that would change the course of these soldiers' lives in a way no one could have predicted. The cub was a Syrian brown bear, a subspecies native to the Middle East and Caucasus Mountains. His mother had been shot by hunters, leaving him orphaned and starving. The boy hoped to sell the cub to passing soldiers for food money. A young girl, the great niece of one of the Polish officers, spotted the cub and was immediately captivated. The soldiers pooled their meager resources, bought the cub for a few tins of food, and suddenly found themselves responsible for a wild animal. Syrian brown bears are among the smallest subspecies of brown bear, typically weighing up to 250 kilograms when fully grown, about 550 pounds. They're characterized by light brown or straw-colored fur, sometimes with a distinctive dark stripe down the back. Uniquely among bears, they have white claws. But in April 1942, this particular cub weighed perhaps 5 or 6 pounds, was severely malnourished, and would have died within days without intervention. The soldiers improvised. They fed him condensed milk from a vodka bottle, the only container suitable for nursing. They supplemented his diet with honey, fruit, and eventually scraps from their own rations. The cub thrived under their care, and as he grew stronger, he became the unofficial mascot of the unit. After 3 months in a refugee camp in Tehran, where the young girl who had first spotted him cared for him, the bear was formally adopted by the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. They named him Wojtek, a diminutive of the Polish name Wojciech, which means happy warrior or smiling warrior. It was a name chosen with hope, a reminder that even in the darkness of exile and war, there could still be moments of joy and connection. As Wojtek grew, he became far more than a mascot. He imitated everything he saw soldiers doing. When they stood at attention, he tried to mimic their posture. When they wrestled and roughhoused during downtime, he joined in, his natural bear strength carefully modulated to avoid hurting his human companions. He learned to drink beer, which he would consume from bottles, sometimes drinking the entire bottle, and then peering through the glass opening to see where more beer might be hiding. He developed a taste for cigarettes, though he didn't smoke them in the traditional sense. Instead, he would accept lit cigarettes, take a puff, and then eat them, tobacco and all. These behaviors might seem comical, even absurd, but they represented something deeper. Wojtek was learning to be part of a military unit. He was observing human behavior and attempting to replicate it, a form of social learning that would prove crucial when the unit faced its greatest test. By late 1943, the Polish forces in the Middle East had been reorganized. The evacuees from the Soviet Union had joined with the independent Carpathian Rifle Brigade, Polish units that had been fighting in North Africa. Together, they formed the Polish Second Corps, approximately 50,000 soldiers organized into 2 infantry divisions and an armored brigade. General Anders commanded this force, which would fight as part of the British 8th Army in the Italian campaign. But there was a problem. The Second Corps was being transferred to Italy, and British regulations strictly forbade mascots and pet animals on transport ships. No exceptions. The soldiers of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company faced a choice: leave Wojtek behind in the Middle East, abandoning the bear who would become part of their family, or find another way. They chose the latter. In a decision that would become legendary, they officially enlisted Wojtek in the Polish army. He was given a serial number, a paybook, and the rank of private. On paper, he became a soldier, complete with his own pay and rations allowance. The British authorities, presented with official military documentation showing Wojtek as an enlisted member of the Polish Second Corps, had no choice but to allow him passage. In early 1944, Wojtek boarded a transport ship bound for Italy. He traveled with his unit, living in the holds alongside human soldiers, eating military rations, participating in the daily routine of army life. By this point, he weighed approximately 90 kilograms, around 200 pounds, and stood roughly 1.8 meters tall when upright, nearly 6 feet. He was still young, not yet fully grown, but already a formidable presence. Two soldiers, Henryk Zakharevich and Dmitr Sablugo, were officially assigned as his caretakers, responsible for his feeding, housing, and general welfare. Wojtek slept in a special wooden crate transported by truck, or sometimes in tents alongside the men. He had become, in every practical sense, a member of the unit. The Second Corps arrived in Italy in December 1943 and January 1944, entering a campaign that had become a bloody stalemate. The Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had been stopped cold at the Gustav Line, a chain of German defensive positions stretching across the width of Italy. The linchpin of this defense was Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino dominated the landscape of central Italy like a medieval fortress. The mountain rose 1,706 feet above the Liri Valley, and atop its summit sat the Benedictine monastery, founded in 529 AD by Saint Benedict himself. The monastery was one of Christianity's holiest sites, a repository of ancient manuscripts and sacred art. But its position made it the key to Rome. Highway 6, the main route to the Italian capital, ran through the valley below. Any army attempting to advance on Rome would have to pass directly beneath Monte Cassino's slopes. The Germans, commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had transformed the mountain into a fortress. They didn't occupy the monastery itself initially, respecting its protected status, but they fortified every cave, every stone building, every natural defensive position on the slopes. German paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division, among the elite forces of the Wehrmacht, held the high ground with interlocking fields of fire that turned the approaches into killing grounds. 3 previous Allied assaults had failed to take the position. In January 1944, the US 36th Infantry Division attempted to cross the Rapido River and suffered over 2,000 casualties in a disaster that would haunt American military leadership for years. In February, the Allies bombed the monastery itself, reducing it to rubble in a controversial decision that ironically created better defensive positions for the Germans, who immediately occupied the ruins. The New Zealand Corps attacked in February and March, gaining ground at terrible cost, but failing to break through. By April 1944, the Allied commanders were desperate. Rome had to be captured. The Italian campaign had to advance, but Monte Cassino stood like a wall of German steel and determination. It was then that General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, met with General Anders. The Polish Second Corps would be given the mission of taking Monte Cassino. It was an assignment that other units had failed to complete, a task that would require the Poles to assault fortified positions up steep mountain slopes against an entrenched enemy. Anders and his Chief of Staff, General Wisniewski, conferred briefly. They knew the cost would be high. They knew the odds were against them. But they also understood what success would mean. Monte Cassino had become world famous. Its capture would announce to the world that Poland was still fighting, that Polish soldiers could accomplish what others could not. It would counter Soviet propaganda, claiming that Poles wouldn't fight Germans, and it would give the men of the Second Corps, most of whom came from eastern Poland, now occupied by the Soviet Union, a chance to strike back the regime that had conquered their homeland in 1939. They accepted the mission. The 4th Battle of Monte Cassino, Operation Diadem, began on the night of May 11, 1944. Over 1,600 Allied artillery pieces opened fire in a massive bombardment designed to suppress German defenses. At 1 a.m. on May 12th, Polish troops began their assault on the monastery and the surrounding heights. They immediately discovered that the artillery had been largely ineffective. The Germans were dug in too deeply, hidden in caves and reinforced bunkers that had survived the bombardment. The fighting was savage. Polish infantry advanced under withering fire, climbing steep slopes while German machine guns and mortars tore through their ranks. The Carpathian Battalion managed to capture Hill 593, a critical position, but German counterattacks drove them back with heavy casualties. On May 12th alone, the Polish Second Corps suffered approximately 860 killed and 3,000 wounded. The assault was called off temporarily to allow the Poles to regroup and reorganize. But Allied pressure elsewhere on the Gustav Line was working. British forces had broken through in the Liri Valley. French troops had captured Monte Mayo. The German line was buckling, but Monte Cassino itself remained in enemy hands. On May 17th, the Poles launched their second major assault. This time, they would succeed. But success would require every man, every resource, every ounce of determination the Second Corps could muster. Even the support and logistics units were mobilized for combat duty. And among those support units was the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, with its most unusual soldier. The work of supplying artillery positions during a major battle is exhausting, dangerous, and absolutely critical. Without a constant flow of ammunition, the guns fall silent. Without shells, the infantry has no fire support. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company's mission was to maintain that flow, to ensure that Polish artillery batteries firing in support of the assault never ran out of ammunition. This meant transporting crates of 25-pound artillery shells from supply dumps to firing positions, often under German counter-battery fire. Each crate weighed approximately 100 pounds, roughly 45 kilograms. Standard procedure required 4 men to lift and carry each crate safely. The work was backbreaking, the pace relentless, and it had to be done regardless of incoming fire, regardless of casualties, regardless of exhaustion. For 3 weeks leading up to the final assault, the supply company worked around the clock. They transported shells, explosives, fuel, food, everything needed to sustain an army in combat. The operation was fraught with risk. Supply convoys had to move at night to avoid German artillery observers. Routes were constantly shelled. Men were killed and wounded performing the unglamorous but essential work of military logistics. And Wojtek was there, observing everything. Wojtek had accompanied the unit throughout the Italian campaign. He had experienced combat before, had heard artillery fire, had witnessed the chaos of battle. But Monte Cassino was different. The intensity of the fighting, the scale of the bombardment, the desperation of the assault created an atmosphere of sustained violence unlike anything the bear had previously experienced. The noise alone should have driven him to hide. Artillery bombardments produce sound levels that can rupture eardrums, shockwaves that can stop hearts. The ground shook continuously. The air smelled of cordite and burning. The sky was lit by muzzle flashes and explosions. Men screamed, weapons fired, shells detonated with concussive force that could be felt in the chest, even at a distance. Wojtek didn't hide. Instead, he watched the soldiers working to move ammunition, and he began to imitate them. Standing upright on his hind legs, as bears naturally do when they want to see better or manipulate objects, Wojtek approached the ammunition crates. He watched men struggling with the weight, working in teams to lift and carry each wooden box. Then, he simply picked one up. A fully grown Syrian brown bear, even a young one like Wojtek, possesses immense strength. What required 4 men to carry safely, Wojtek could lift alone. He grasped the crates with his powerful front legs, holding them against his chest in a bear hug, and carried them to where they needed to go. He would stack boxes onto trucks or pile them near ammunition depots, working with a purposeful efficiency that amazed everyone who witnessed it. And he never dropped a single crate. This is not an exaggeration or military legend. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. British soldiers saw him and filed reports. Polish veterans attested to it in post-war interviews. Photographic evidence exists showing Wojtek handling ammunition. The Bear's contribution to the supply operation was real, measurable, and significant. But perhaps more importantly, his presence boosted morale in a way that's difficult to quantify. Soldiers under extreme stress, facing death daily, found moments of levity and humanity in watching their Bear comrade work alongside them. Wojtek represented something beyond the military machine. He was a reminder that life continued, that connections mattered, that even in the midst of industrial-scale violence, there could still be loyalty, companionship, and purpose. For the German defenders witnessing this spectacle, the psychological impact must have been profound. They were facing an enemy so confident, so seemingly unconcerned with the rules of conventional warfare, that they brought a bear into combat. The sight of Wojtek calmly carrying ammunition while shells exploded around him must have seemed surreal, a symbol of the bizarre nightmare that war had become. The final Polish assault on May 17th and 18th involved brutal close-quarters combat among the monastery ruins. Polish infantry cleared German positions room by room, cave by cave, fighting with rifles, grenades, and sometimes bare hands. The Germans, recognizing that their line had been broken elsewhere and that Monte Cassino was now isolated, began a tactical withdrawal during the night of May 17th and 18th. At 10:20 a.m. on May 18th, 1944, a patrol from the 12th Podolski Cavalry Regiment reached the summit of Monte Cassino. They found the monastery in ruins, only a few wounded German soldiers unable to retreat. A Polish soldier raised a homemade regimental flag over the rubble. A bugler played the Krakow Hejnal, the traditional Polish bugle call. Soon after, both a Polish flag and a Union Jack were raised in recognition of the British-Polish alliance. Monte Cassino had fallen. The Gustav Line was broken. The road to Rome lay open. The cost had been staggering. The Polish Second Corps suffered 924 killed, 2,931 wounded, and 345 missing during the final phase of the Monte Cassino operation. Total Allied casualties for the entire 4-month campaign exceeded 55,000 men. The Germans lost approximately 20,000 killed and wounded. The monastery that had stood for 1,400 years was reduced to rubble, approximately 70% destroyed. But the strategic significance was undeniable. Within days, Allied forces would enter Rome. The Italian campaign could continue northward, and the Polish flag flying over Monte Cassino announced to the world that Poland had not been defeated, that Polish soldiers could achieve what others could not. In recognition of his service during the Battle of Monte Cassino, Private Wojtek was promoted to corporal. The promotion was official, recorded in military documents, acknowledged by Polish High Command. More significantly, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company redesigned its emblem. The new insignia showed a bear carrying an artillery shell, a direct tribute to Wojtek's contribution to the battle. This emblem became one of the most recognizable symbols of the Polish Second Corps. It appeared on unit flags, on vehicles, on shoulder patches worn by every soldier in the company. Long after the war, veterans of the Second Corps would identify themselves by that symbol, the bear carrying a shell, a reminder of the extraordinary circumstances under which they had fought. Wojtek continued to serve with the Second Corps throughout the remainder of the Italian campaign. The unit fought in subsequent battles, including the capture of Ancona on the Adriatic coast and the final operations in the Po Valley. Throughout all of this, Wojtek remained with his unit, participating in the daily life of soldiers at war. Visiting Allied generals and dignitaries made a point of meeting the bear soldier. He became a celebrity, featured in newspapers and newsreels, a symbol of the unusual circumstances and human connections that war sometimes produced. But for the men of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, he was simply their comrade, their friend, their Wojtek. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the men of the Polish Second Corps faced a bitter reality. Poland was not free. The Soviet Union had occupied the eastern territories from which most of these soldiers came. The government in Warsaw was a Soviet puppet. The Western Allies, exhausted by war and unwilling to confront Stalin, had effectively consented to Poland's absorption into the communist sphere. Most soldiers of the Second Corps chose not to return to Poland. They feared Soviet retribution for having fought under Western command. Many had family members who had disappeared into Soviet labor camps. They couldn't go home. The Polish Second Corps was transported to Britain and stationed in Scotland, waiting for a political resolution that would never come. On November 15, 1947, the unit was officially demobilized. The soldiers had to decide their futures. Some emigrated to the United States, Canada, Australia. Others remained in Britain, building new lives in a land that was not their homeland, but it offered them refuge. And Wojtek? He was given to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he lived in an enclosure that couldn't possibly replicate the companionship and purpose he had known during the war. But his former comrades visited him regularly. Polish veterans, now civilians working jobs in Scotland, would come to the zoo to see their old friend. They would speak to him in Polish, and Wojtek would respond, recognizing their voices, the language, the connection to his past life. Visitors to the zoo would sometimes see these middle-aged men in civilian clothes, standing before a bear's enclosure, speaking softly in a foreign language, and the bear would approach, pressing against the bars, reaching out, as if trying to touch them. The zoo staff noted that Wojtek always seemed more animated, more alive, when his Polish friends visited. He died on December 2, 1963, at the age of 21, weighing nearly 500 kilograms, over 1,100 pounds, the size he would have reached, living wild in the mountains of his birth. He had lived longer than most Syrian brown bears in the wild, cared for by the zoo staff, but undoubtedly missing the companionship and purpose that had defined his life. In the decades since his death, Wojtek's story has taken on legendary status. Statues of him now stand in multiple countries. In Scotland, there are monuments in Edinburgh, Duns, and elsewhere, recognizing his connection to the Polish veterans who made Scotland their home. In Poland, statues have been erected in Warsaw, Krakow, Poznan, and other cities, honoring the bear as a symbol of Polish resilience during the war. In Italy, a statue stands in the town of Cassino, near the battlefield where Wojtek made his most significant contribution. His image has appeared on commemorative coins, in books, in documentary films, in children's stories. The Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, a Scottish military unit, adopted a connection to Wojtek's memory, recognizing the link between Scottish hosts and Polish veterans. But beyond the memorials and the legends, what does Wojtek's story actually mean? At one level, it's a tale of the absurdity of war. The fact that a bear could be enlisted as a soldier, given rank and pay, and serve in combat reveals how bureaucracy and necessity can produce outcomes that defy logic. The regulations said, no mascots allowed, so the Poles made him a soldier. The situation required moving ammunition, so the bear, who had learned to imitate human behavior, contributed to that effort. War creates circumstances where the impossible becomes routine. At another level, it's a story about the human need for connection, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The men of the Polish Second Corps had lost their country, their families, often their hope for the future. They were fighting for a homeland that might never be free, following orders from governments in exile, forming emotional bonds, knowing that separation or death could come at any moment. Wojtek provided something constant in a world of chaos. He was a living connection to a simpler time, a reminder that care and loyalty mattered even when surrounded by destruction. The relationship between soldiers and animals in war is well documented. Horses carried cavalry, Dogs detected mines. Pigeons delivered messages. But Wojtek was different. He wasn't trained for a specific military task. He wasn't bred for war. He was an orphaned, wild animal who learned to be part of a human community and chose to participate in that community's struggles. His presence at Monte Cassino, carrying ammunition while shells exploded around him, represents something profound about the nature of learned behavior and social bonding. Wojtek wasn't following instinct. Bears don't naturally carry wooden crates. He was replicating what he had observed, contributing to a collective effort because he had become part of that collective. Modern animal behaviorists would recognize this as sophisticated social learning, the kind of behavior that indicates not just intelligence, but emotional investment in a social group. Wojtek had imprinted on the Polish soldiers who raised him, viewing them as his family, his troop, his unit. When they worked, he worked. When they faced danger, he didn't flee. The bond was genuine, reciprocal, and powerful enough to overcome the natural impulses of a wild animal in a combat zone. For the German defenders at Monte Cassino, witnessing a bear calmly working in a supply chain while under fire must have been deeply unsettling. It suggested an enemy that operated outside the normal parameters of military logic, an opponent whose confidence and morale was so strong that they could integrate a wild animal into their combat operations. Psychological warfare doesn't always require deliberate planning. Sometimes, it's just the accumulated weight of small details that break an enemy's will to resist. The Polish victory at Monte Cassino was achieved through courage, tactical skill, artillery support, and the grinding persistence of infantry assault against fortified positions. Wojtek's contribution was small in the grand scheme of the battle. But symbols matter in war. They matter to those who fight and to those who remember. The men of the Polish Second Corps accomplished something extraordinary at Monte Cassino. They succeeded where others had failed, breaking through defenses that had held for months against repeated assaults. They did this knowing that even victory couldn't restore their homeland, that Poland's freedom was already being bartered away in diplomatic conferences to which they were not invited. Wojtek was there with them, carrying shells, providing companionship, reminding them that loyalty and service transcended politics and borders. He couldn't change the strategic situation. He couldn't bring back the Poland that existed before September 1939. But he could be present, contributing what he was able to contribute, standing with his adopted family in their moment of greatest need. That's not a small thing. That's actually everything that matters. Today, the Polish military cemetery at Monte Cassino holds the graves of 1,072 Polish soldiers who died in the Italian campaign. The graves are arranged in neat rows on the hillside below where the monastery once stood. An inscription reads, "For your freedom and ours, we, soldiers of Poland, gave our soul to God, our bodies to the soil of Italy, and our hearts to Poland." These men fought knowing the probable cost. They fought anyway. And in doing so, they created a legacy that outlasted the political circumstances that shaped their war. The story of Monte Cassino became a symbol of Polish resistance, Polish determination, and Polish sacrifice that would inspire future generations. Wojtek is buried at Edinburgh Zoo, where he spent his final years. But his memory is preserved in monuments, stories, and in the collective consciousness of anyone who learns about the soldier bear of Monte Cassino. His story has been told to children in Poland for decades, a tale of loyalty and courage that transcends the complexity of wartime politics. The question that remains is simple. What made Wojtek's story resonate so deeply? Why does a bear carrying ammunition during the Second World War continue to captivate people more than 80 years later? Perhaps it's because the story contains elements that are fundamentally human. The impulse to rescue something helpless, the bonds formed through shared struggle, the ways in which individuals find meaning and purpose, even in circumstances designed to destroy both. Wojtek's story is ultimately about connection overcoming circumstance, about loyalty that exists outside of rational calculation, about the small moments of humanity that persist even in the heart of mechanized warfare. The Polish soldiers who bought an orphaned bear cub in Iran in 1942 couldn't have predicted where that act of compassion would lead. They couldn't have known that their mascot would become a soldier, that he would serve at one of the most famous battles of the war, that his memory would outlast them and be preserved in monuments across multiple continents. They just saw something that needed help and decided to help it. Everything else followed from that one decision. In a war characterized by industrial-scale killing, by political betrayal, by the destruction of entire communities and ways of life, that matters. It matters that men who had every reason to be hardened, cynical, and focused solely on survival chose instead to care for something that served no military purpose. It matters that they integrated that care into their military life, rather than abandoning it when circumstances became difficult. It matters that Wojtek, given the opportunity to flee or to simply exist passively, chose instead to participate, to contribute, to serve alongside those who had saved him. The German soldiers defending Monte Cassino saw many things that shook their confidence during those months of combat. They saw the determination of American, British, Indian, New Zealand, French, and finally Polish troops who kept coming despite terrible losses. They saw the material superiority of the Allies, the endless artillery, the constant airstrikes, the replacement units that kept filling the ranks of attacking forces. They saw their own defensive line, considered impregnable, eventually broken by sheer persistent pressure. But perhaps nothing captured the reality of their situation quite like the sight of a bear calmly carrying ammunition through an artillery barrage. That image, impossible and yet real, symbolized an essential truth. They were fighting an enemy that couldn't be broken, because that enemy found meaning and purpose in things beyond military logic. Wojtek carried shells at Monte Cassino because he had learned to imitate the humans who raised him. But he also carried them because he was part of a community, and communities take care of each other. That simple fact, embodied in the unlikely form of a Syrian brown bear serving as a corporal in the Polish army, represents the enduring lesson of his extraordinary life. War destroys, but even in the midst of destruction, there are moments when creation persists, when care matters, when connections form that transcend the circumstances that created them, when an orphaned bear cub and a group of exiled soldiers find each other in the mountains of Iran and build something that will be remembered long after the empires and ideologies of their era have crumbled into history. Wojtek, the soldier bear of Monte Cassino, died in 1963. But his story lives on, told and retold, because it captures something essential about what it means to be human. Even, apparently, when you're not human at all. Even when you're a bear who learned to stand upright, carry ammunition, and serve with distinction in one of the most famous battles of the Second World War. That's the story. That's the legacy. And that's why, more than 80 years later, we still remember the bear who carried shells on that blood-soaked Italian mountainside and changed the way we think about loyalty, service, and the bonds that form between those who face death together. If you found this story as remarkable as I did, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. The history of World War II is filled with extraordinary tales of courage, innovation, and humanity in the darkest circumstances. Each week, we uncover another forgotten story, another moment when the impossible became real, another reminder that history is far stranger and more compelling than any fiction. Don't miss what's coming next. Until then, remember Wojtek. Remember the Polish soldiers who saved him. Remember Monte Cassino. And remember that even in war, there are moments when something as simple as caring for an orphaned animal can create a legacy that outlasts empires.